Change is possible. This podcast will show you how.
Anna, we usually ask people that come on this podcast about the most challenging moments of their lives. That's how we start it. But you obviously have had so much clinical experience working with people in addiction and different mental health challenges. Could you give us an example of someone that had an extremely challenging problem in their life and how they came through that change?
Sure, I'm happy to. I want to preface this by saying that I do have permission from this patient to share his story for the purposes of educating the public, and I do share his story in my book, Dopamine Nation. So this is a patient, not his real name, pseudonym Jacob, who very early on in his life discovered that pornography and masturbation was a source of comfort, a source of dealing with difficult emotions, a way to escape for a period of time, not be in his own head, not be in his own body. And obviously, this is a very prevalent phenomenon. I'm sure many of your listeners can relate. I personally can relate. Which is also, by the way, something that I talk about in the book, is how I got addicted to romance novels and how I saw myself in many ways in this patient. But basically, he's a very brilliant man. He's a very kind person. And what happened is that as he began using more and more pornography and masturbating for longer periods of time, he's a scientist, he's an engineer, and he ultimately built a primitive masturbation machine out of a record player that he attached to this coil, that he attached to a piece of cloth, that he attached to, his genitalia. And he would use this machine, repeatedly over many hours a day. As he developed tolerance, he actually coupled it with smoking cigarettes because he realized that was a way to augment the pleasure, but also delay the orgasm. I'm sharing this level of detail just to sort of describe the lengths to which we will go to kind of self-soothe, and also specifically to highlight the ways in which modern technology has allowed us to potentiate these methods of self-soothing to a point that is really unprecedented in human history. So just to fast forward over time, as the internet came online pornography, he went from sort of, moderate use of pornography and still functioning in his life to, by the time he was, a professor at university, finding that he really couldn't function because he would spend days at a time online viewing pornography, masturbating, and his very early prototypical masturbation machine eventually morphed into a very sophisticated machine that he, hooked up stereos and electricity. And, I would say at the sort of ultimate progression of his disease process was actually allowing other people live streaming in chat rooms to manipulate the device. And the reason that this is really important is because that was incredibly dangerous, right? I mean, he could have easily electrocuted himself, or somebody could have accidentally or on purpose harmed him. Again, wanting to really highlight the ways in which technology has taken behaviors that really have been around since the beginning of time. I can't remember, there's one public intellectual who joked that the reason that our arms are just so long is because, right. But the point is that, through the application of science and technology, we've really drugified all of these behaviors. And my patient Jacob is sort of this kind of a microcosm of the ways in which it's now led to this phenomenon where we're really killing ourselves or at risk, of hurting ourselves. So that's sort of an introduction to this patient.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Anna, because I've read your brilliant book, Dopamine Nation, and I knew you had permission of certain clients, and I was wondering which clients, which clients you would pick, and it's really interesting that you chose the one with the technology linked, because you've described technology and especially phones as the modern day hypodermic needle, but it's that combination of addiction from the past and using technology just to augment and amplify that dopamine hit that we get so we can just increase the pleasure and then increase the drive for those behaviors as well. It's crazy.
Yeah, and when you link that to the neuroscience of addiction and what's actually happening in our brains, what you see is that no matter how much pleasure we get, no matter how potent the reinforcing stimulus is, our brain will adapt to it. We are like the ultimate adapters, such that over time it stops working. We need more of it in more potent forms to get the same effect. This is often called tolerance. And our drug can then ultimately actually turn on us and do the opposite of what it used to do. And it's like a physiologic phenomenon, such that now we're using not to, solve a problem or feel good or get high. We're actually using to stop being in pain. And the thing that we're doing to stop being in pain is actually causing us more pain.
Oh, I personally, obviously my story of addiction, and I sort of think about that metaphorically. It's like you're using the drugs, and it's like a big thick spring being pushed and coiled and squeezed together. And then when the drugs are gone and there's no more drugs and they don't work anymore, it's just the coil just unleashes this ball of anxiety and pain, and that's what I felt like. It was really crazy. Um, the idea of this podcast as well, Anna, it's really like helping people to understand how change is possible. And I do want to get into the weeds on that later. But in terms of Jacob, could you tell us a little bit about where he was? Like, that's an extreme story of addiction and pleasure seeking and the challenges he faced. And I'm sure there was mental health and trauma based challenges, I would imagine, psychological challenges underpinning that as well. How did you help him to come around?
Yeah. So I guess before starting there, let me just also speak to the depths of his despair, because I think when it comes especially to talking about sexual behaviors, there can be a lot of debate about, sexual mores and repressed sexuality. And, are we just judging people's choices? And what I always like to emphasize is there's no judgment here. There's just um, somebody coming in and saying, I want to stop this behavior. I'm not able to stop. I have had very serious consequences. In Jacob's case, his wife left him. He was very compromised at work, and he was so filled with despair that he actually very seriously contemplated suicide, to the point where he had created a noose, hung it, knew exactly, what he was going to do. And I just want to bring that in there to emphasize that this is, I'm not standing in judgment of people's sexual predilections or preferences or behaviors. This is really kind of a crucible of those behaviors and their leading to despair in a given individual. So how did Jacob get into recovery? The mainstay of his recovery started with abstinence from those behaviors. And really only through abstinence in this case was he able to reset those reward pathways, such that he was no longer in that constant state of craving, and he could actually release his brain and his own creativity and energy to focus on other things. But abstinence from sexual behaviors in a world that is constantly titillating us and inviting us to consume is very difficult. So he also employed what we call self-binding strategies, which is both literal and metacognitive barriers that he placed between himself and his drug of choice, so that he could press the pause button between desire and consumption. So this was things like throwing away his masturbation machine, not just in his garbage can, but in a dumpster 5 miles away. Why? Because he had repeatedly thrown it away in his own garbage can or put it away somewhere in his garage or up high in a closet, and found himself the next day pulling it down again and setting it up. So it was really getting rid of it to the extent that he was able. Other self-binding strategies included creating barriers on all of his devices so that he wouldn't have easy access to pornography. And then also looking at what I call the stepping stone effect. What are the things that we do that aren't the drug itself, but that incite cravings for the drug? And for him, that included things like watching YouTube videos of women playing volleyball. So he had to also eliminate the kinds of things that would trigger him to want to do that. So that was sort of step number one. Step number two was also biological intervention. So for sex, pornography, and compulsive masturbation addiction, we often prescribe a class of antidepressants called the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We do that in part to help manage depression and anxiety, but we also do it because it has sexual side effects that decrease libido, delay orgasm, decrease pleasure from the orgasm in some instances. So it's kind of like a chemical self-binding strategy. And then, again, when I conceptualize addiction, I use the classic biopsychosocial model. So there are biological risk factors and biological interventions, psychological risk factors and psychological interventions, and environmental risk factors and environmental interventions. So on the biological side, abstinence to reset reward pathways, and an SSRI to help decrease libido and manage anxiety. On the psychological interventions, typically we wouldn't explore in any deep fashion like childhood trauma or other traumas until that person is in recovery. And the reason for that is that we have found, and the evidence supports, that when people have had at least a month of abstinence, many of their psychological symptoms resolve spontaneously without our having to do any other intervention. So we want to get people sort of as well as we can before we reassess and potentially diagnose a psychiatric disorder or try to explore psychological factors. But certainly in that psychological category, individual psychotherapy can be very helpful. And he pursued individual psychotherapy with a very talented therapist who was seeing him in tandem with me. And doing weekly individual psychotherapy. And then in the environmental contextual one, we talked about self-binding strategies, but the other piece of that is surrounding ourselves with other people who are working on long-term recovery. And for him, key here was Sexaholics Anonymous. It's a 12-step based group to help people struggling with sex and pornography addiction. And so he got a sponsor, he worked the 12 steps, and he found that also very helpful.
So a real multi-pronged approach, and I suppose that's what's really needed for such an extreme case. I love the biopsychosocial model as well. It's just a great framework for looking at addiction specifically, and I'd love to bring it back nearly to make it more, I suppose, applicable to people in everyday society in terms of people that are drinking too much, people who are addicted to their phones, and maybe it hasn't their alcohol use hasn't hit the addiction threshold, but there's binge drinking, there's problematic drinking and stuff like that. How does the impact of dopamine play a role in that? And what are the greatest challenges you see for people today with those more generalized addictions? I suppose you can throw food into that bracket as well.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. It's like addiction with a little a instead of addiction with a big A, sort
Yeah.
of these smaller addictions or these pre-addicted states. And sort of what your question, what role does dopamine? And addiction is a spectrum disorder. So you can have mild, moderate, or severe addiction, or you can be pre-addicted or have little addictions. Um, and the phenomenology and the physiology is exactly the same process. We all have reward pathways, right, in our brains. These are conserved over millions of years of evolution to have us reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. That's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. When we find a behavior or a substance or really any activity that's reinforcing, that is to say, pleasurable, We release dopamine in our brain's reward pathway. The more dopamine that we release and the faster that we release, the more likely that substance or pleasure is to be something that we want to do again. And in general, when we talk about reward, we can begin with thinking about natural rewards: food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate. These are things that we are all wired to want because they're core to our survival. And when we get addicted to a substance or a behavior, basically we are getting addicted to something that mimics one of those natural rewards. And whatever the complex chemical cascade is through which addictive substances and behaviors work, the final common pathway is to release dopamine in the reward pathway. Again, the more that's released, the faster that it's released, the more likely it is to be addictive. And the hallmark of intoxicants or substances and behaviors that we see a lot of people getting addicted to, the hallmark is that they release more dopamine and they release it faster in the brain's reward pathway. The other thing that is universal across all humans is that when our brain sees a lot of dopamine released all at once, it has a natural and reflexive compensatory mechanism, which is to downregulate dopamine transmission to bring it back to baseline levels of firing, because we're always releasing dopamine at these kind of tonic baseline levels. It's kind of like the heartbeat of the reward pathway in the brain. But we tend to overshoot that so that we lower dopamine transmission, not just to baseline initially, but actually below baseline, for example, by involuting postsynaptic dopamine receptors. And that puts us in a dopamine deficit state, which is essentially the state of craving. Now, if we wait long enough, a minute, an hour, a day, whatever it is, that craving tends to dissipate, dopamine levels go back to baseline, and we're kind of go on our way. But in this world of overwhelming overabundance, where we all have instantaneous, frictionless access to more of the things that released all that dopamine in our brains, the faster way to bring our levels back up is to have some more. And so that's what we do. And that's how we're wired. It's totally natural to do that. The problem is that with repeated exposure over days to weeks to months to years, our brains basically say, hey, I am getting this exogenous or external source of reinforcement. I no longer need to make very much dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine or endogenous opioids or endogenous cannabinoids, because I'm getting this external source, which is doing all the work for me. And the result is that we end up downregulating all of those feel-good neurotransmitters that we really need to motivate us, to feel okay with our lives, to take joy in modest rewards. And that's the vicious cycle of addiction.
And is that, I love that, and the detail of that's a few things in there that I never actually realized. But is that the idea as well, that when we get these external rewards coming in, that the level of those natural rewards is just does absolutely nothing for us, and the key then is abstinence, so we can sort of bring the system back into balance. And a month is the sort of the mark that you find is where people are at for that.
Yeah, so you got that exactly right.
Yeah.
And a month, it's not like your addiction is cured in a month. I
Yeah.
mean, we think of
Yeah.
addiction as a chronic, relapsing, and remitting disease. But what's so interesting about the various addictions and the different types of individuals and the different histories with their addictive behaviors is that about 80% of folks with a month of abstinence will start to feel better. They won't be 100% better, but the majority of people will notice significant improvement with 30 days of abstinence, especially in terms of getting out of this state of constant craving and the irritability and anxiety and dysphoria and insomnia that are the hallmarks of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior. But I don't want to leave your listeners with the erroneous conclusion that somehow addiction is cured in a month. That's not at all it. But what,
Certainly not.
but what we have after a month is enough experiential learning to be able to say, oh, wow, I thought that this behavior was making my life better. And in fact, I see now that it was making my life worse, and I feel a lot better than I have. I think I'm going to see what else might be involved here with trying to change my relationship with this substance. The other thing that I really want to emphasize is that abstinence is not the only way to restore baseline homeostasis. For example, people with severe opioid addiction, we often prescribe them opioids, which is kind of counterintuitive. But in those individuals, in some cases, we feel like even long periods of abstinence don't reset their reward pathways, that perhaps they've lost some innate plasticity such that they will never get out of that craving state no matter how long they abstain. And we know that giving those individuals uh, opioids prescribed under the supervision of a doctor actually allows them to go back to their baseline so that they can free up their psyches to engage in other aspects of recovery. So that's also a perfectly valid form of treatment.
Yeah, it's really important to recognize that because I've often found like there's so many entry points into addiction and so many entry points into recovery. It's so complex and it's so different for everybody. And I often feel myself it's anecdotal evidence, but I think it was a year before I felt my biology was in some sort of homeostasis, probably even longer than that as well. But I think those opportunities of abstinence then allow you the space to do the work and to work with therapists, to work with different people to get your body healthy to be able to bring it back into balance. I think that's the key for many people.
Yeah, and that's a super important point because there is evidence to show that in people with severe addictions, really minimum 90 days or 3 months to feel better, and in some cases, much longer, 12 months, 18
Yeah.
months. So I counsel a lot of patience to my patients that really, just keep going, just stick with abstinence. You will feel better as your brain slowly gets the message that it's not getting this exogenous source, that it needs to start to upregulate its own feel good hormones and neurotransmitters, while also recognizing that many people with addiction have co occurring psychiatric disorders, and that even if they can feel better with stopping their addictive behaviors, they might at baseline have a depressive disorder, have an anxiety
Yeah.
disorder, have post traumatic stress disorder, or OCD, or a psychotic disorder. And so it's really important to integrate treatment with those co occurring disorders with the treatment for addiction. Because if we don't do that, the person is at greater risk for relapse. And I just want to highlight that historically, what's happened, in healthcare is that we sort of had mental health treatment over here and sort of had addiction treatment over here, and never the twain shall meet. And what we know is that, if we just focus on the mental health care and the co-occurring psychiatric disorder, and we don't treat people with addiction and they keep using, no matter how much we do over here, the folks are not going to get better. And likewise, on the addiction side, even if we can get people to abstain and to not use and into recovery, if we don't target their psychiatric symptoms, that's going to be a huge trigger for relapse. So what we really need to do is integrate those treatments simultaneously.
Yeah, I often say that about my own addiction and my own recovery, and like the addiction, the heroin was a symptom of an underlying problem, which was anxiety. And now I've changed my relationship with anxiety, so I've nothing to avoid, nothing to escape anymore. But it was working on both things at the same time that really allowed me this space for healing. And there's a question I'd love to ask you, Anna, because I had a couple of friends, really good friends in addiction. My partner in crime, I'd say, in the addiction as well when I was in the depths of it. And for some people I know, it feels like they're too far gone, and it feels like yeah, I feel like there's no hope. Is recovery from addiction possible for everyone, or are some people just gone too far?
Oh, yeah, such a a sad question.
Mm,
Um, I honestly believe that there is always hope. And the
that's
reason
beautiful
I
to hear.
say that, the reason I say that because I have had patients over the years, well into their 50s, 60s, decades of serious addictive behaviors, who I personally thought, I'm not going to be able to help this person or they're not going to be able to get into recovery. And then they did. So, miracles happen. They really do. However you want to define a miracle. I mean, I just feel like I've seen miracles. And so I always maintain hope no matter what. Having said that, it's very clear that addiction can be a terminal disease, that people can die of their disease. We see it every day, whether in the context of a drug overdose because people are addicted, or they're drinking and driving and they're addicted, or, whatever the circumstance may be. So, yeah, I mean, we have to have a healthy respect for the potential lethality of this terrible disease. And I really do think that we have to conceptualize it as a disease, right? So there's a lot of chatter out there. Oh, is it really a disease? Isn't it just, a learned behavior? I mean, it is a learned behavior for sure. But I think we have to really say this is a brain disease. And we need to do that for a lot of reasons. Number one, when we treat it like a brain disease inside the House of Medicine, people show good response rates. Their response rates are as good as people who are treated for things like depression or obesity, certain forms of asthma or cardiac disease. So the medical model really works. I also think the medical model is sort of how we frame suffering now. I mean, almost everything is a disease. So if we leave addiction out of that, we're really not being fair to a process that actually has more robust brain science to support the disease pathophysiology than any other mental illness. I mean, if you look at the
Yeah.
animal models of addiction, they're much more robust than animal models of depression or anxiety. If you look at brain imaging research or other, human studies, it's very clear. There's this distinct phenomenology that is associated with this distinct, change in dopamine levels in the brain when people are deep in their addiction. So, I just think it makes so much sense to conceptualize it as a disease in this time period right now, which isn't to say, that there aren't other ways of framing it, but I think that this is an important way to frame it now.
That's really interesting because like there's no biological markers for depression or anxiety, and people are quite shocked by that. But like, let's say, and you mentioned it earlier, like addiction is on a spectrum. So the reward pathway, we have the liking system, the wanting system, which can become pathological craving. So I don't think, and I could be wrong here, and if you can correct me, but there's no biological marker for addiction. But if you look at a hijacked brain that is hijacked in the reward pathways, it's not so much a biological marker, but it's a very clear marker of addictive traits. So where's the research on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's, as of yet, no
Yeah.
brain scan or blood test to diagnose addiction, just as there is no brain scan or blood test to diagnose any mental health disorder.
Yeah.
All of our diagnoses are based on what we call phenomenology, which is patterns of behavior that repeat themselves across temperaments, cultures, time periods, geographies. When we think about the criteria for addiction, um, what's so kind of distinct about addiction is that the diagnosis is clearly based on compulsive overconsumption despite harm to self and or others. Whereas, a diagnosis of depression is much harder, actually, much more nebulous. It's sort of like this subjective, have you felt sad or had less interest for most of the day, every day for 2 or more weeks? Whereas, a child could observe addictive behavior, in their family. Do you know what I mean? It's so behavior based, and that it's just a very clear diagnosis, at least on the extreme end of it.
How many podcasts have a sponsor whose primary objective is creating positive changes around the world? With a focus on nurturing youth well-being, the Kind Foundation's message is simple. Kindness is powerful and worth paying forward. In each episode, we share a challenge inspired by their work and ethos. Small actions create big ripples. This week's challenge is about finding the joy. Simply take time this week to find joy in your life, whether that's with loved ones, having your first cup of coffee in the morning, or walking out in nature. Find the joy in your life today.
And there was one other point I'd love to ask you as well. It's like the idea, obviously, calling it a biological, using the biological model for addiction, is the optimal way of doing it. But for somebody, and I often think of myself, like I had, let's say, certain challenges in my life that created anxieties in my life. And I believe that that's where the core of my addiction came from. Let's say more of a trauma informed model. But there's the biological models is still a way of treating it in that way, even though it came from an environmental factor. Is that still the way of framing it, the way you see it?
Yeah, so there are many doorways into
Yeah,
addiction, many potential risk factors. We know that simple genetics is a risk factor. If you have a
yeah.
biological parent or grandparent with addiction, you're more likely to develop addiction yourself, even if raised outside of that substance using home. We know that childhood trauma is a risk factor. We don't know the mechanism by which that works, but it's probably some kind of epigenetic phenomenon, meaning that there are changes in the DNA that, based on experience, that lead to changes in gene expression, that lead to changes in our proteins that make us more vulnerable to addiction. Although again, the exact mechanism is not
Is
well
on
worked
own.
out. And then, of course, there are environmental risk factors. So one of the biggest risk factors for addiction is simple access to our drug of choice. If you happen to go to a doctor who's free with their prescription pad, you're more likely to be exposed to certain controlled substances and hence more likely to get addicted to them. So whatever your doorway in, the pathophysiology is the same. If you're using to have fun or you're using because you're depressed or anxious or in pain, it doesn't really matter. It's not working differently on your reward pathway. You still get the same perturbations in dopamine release and the same kind of neuroadaptation that leads to this compulsive cycle.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. There's a question, Anna, I get again and again and again. It's another very sad question that I get, and I'm sure you would get it off people, especially in terms of friendships and stuff like that, that know you work in the field. And so many people ask me, like, what can I do to help a family member in addiction? What would your answer be for them? I have a multifaceted answer myself, but I'd love to hear what
Oh, yeah, I'd love to hear your answer.
insights you could share.
Yeah. Um,
Well, we did discuss it a little bit before, and I'm using a modified answer based on your expertise on it as well. But I used to believe that there's nothing we can really do. You can't change the person, but you gave me the brilliant insight that we can facilitate consequences. And then when we had that discussion, we can facilitate safe consequences. So if they're lying on the floor asleep, drunk, don't put them to bed and they wake up from a blackout thinking they got to bed. Leave them on the floor. So when they wake up, oh my God, I'm on the floor. Or if they're going to lose their job, don't cover losing their job. Maybe losing their job will save their life. So that's something, since my last conversation with you, facilitating safe consequences is my go-to answer. So I probably robbed your answer a little bit because I got that off you last time, but
Love it. You know what? I like your language better than mine. I don't know what I said, but I'm gonna steal now in
steal it back.
way, facilitating safe
It was
consequences.
a joint effort last time, I remember.
Joint effort. That's great. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And what is so fascinating about addiction is that it becomes a family system problem. And this gets to the heart of codependency. And codependency is really this, I think it's a fascinating and brilliant concept that arose out of the early 12-step movement when Dr. Bob and Bill
Did
W.
it? I didn't
Yep,
know
they
that.
founded
Oh,
Alcoholics Anonymous, a gathering of drunks who were there to help each other through the 12-step process and who all happened to be male. And meanwhile, their wives met in the kitchen and started to talk amongst themselves and started to realize that they enabled, through various well-intentioned means,
wow.
their husbands or their partners' addictions. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about codependency and enabling and the ways in which, with the best of intentions, we can actually make our loved one's addiction worse by doing things like uh, not letting them experience the natural consequences, the natural safe consequences of their disease process. And I think it even goes a step further in that we can get actually addicted to the enabling process. So it's not just that we're trying to help them, but actually we can get to a point where it sort of becomes our own addiction to kind of be the savior, to be the martyr, to
Yeah.
swoop in,
Yeah.
to do everything, in the name of helping this loved one. And so you get this very, very complicated, very dysfunctional family system or couple system. And I see this all the time in clinical care. And I tell you, it is almost easier to treat the addict than it is to
Wow.
treat the codependent. I see often, this is just what my clinical experience, mothers who even into their 70s and 80s are still sending money to their addicted middle-aged child, telling themselves that they're doing it because so and so ended up going into the emergency room and had to pay a medical bill, or someone stole their credit card. I mean, it's the same. I mean, these are very intelligent people, right? I mean, and anybody can see that these are lies, and they're using the money for drugs or whatever their addiction is, and yet the anxiety that is created for these codependent individuals when they try to stop that behavior. You've never seen anything like it. And let me just say, I don't want to other this either, because as a mother myself, and having grown up in a family of alcoholics, so like enmeshment and codependency is all over my family tree. And even for all the work that I've done personally and all my knowledge, I really struggle with codependency as a mother, even raising my own children, like when to step in and when to just let them have natural consequences. So it's
It's
not like
hard.
it's easy, like it's
It's
hard.
hard.
It's
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. It's easy to give advice. It's hard to
It's easy to
implement
give
it.
advice to other
Yeah.
people or to see
But
their problem.
that's
Like, if you see it someone else so clearly, but
yeah.
when we're enmeshed and codependent, it's like, "No,
Yeah.
no, I need to do this."
Yeah. That's fascinating because I never thought of enabling and codependency in terms of self-deception, rationalization, and justification. And it's like a web of lies you tell yourself to keep that identity alive as the compassionate helper. But it's probably more challenging because you see yourself as a savior, the good person, the saint that's helping. Whereas the person in addiction sort of has the knowledge. They don't have the awareness, but they have the knowledge that the drugs are bad for them. Whereas the enabler or the codependency can't even see that. It's a trickier game nearly. That's fascinating. That is really
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, and the other thing that can
Yeah.
happen is that in a family system, you can have, like, the identified sick person, which is often the addict, and then the identified well person or helper, who is the person trying to help, and sometimes they're not codependent or enmeshed, they're just trying to help.
Yeah.
But when they are codependent and enmeshed, and the person with the addiction gets into recovery, it is fascinating to see the codependent individual just get totally crazy. Because now all of a sudden, like, their own issues are unmasked and they're not addressing them and never did because it was all about getting the addict into recovery. But when the addict is in recovery and doing well, it's like, well, wait a minute, who actually is the sick person here?
Oh, yeah. And I've seen examples of that where they nearly, I wouldn't say push them back into addiction, but they guide it that way unintentionally to a certain extent, but they feel safer in that place.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly
Yeah.
what we're talking about, yeah. And it's
Wow.
mostly unconscious. These are
Yeah.
mostly unconscious processes.
Yeah. And what would you say? And I suppose what I say to people is facilitate those safe consequences, but ultimately you need to look after yourself. Like that's what you can control, how you respond to the challenges, looking after yourself. And in my life, like I found recovery and I tried to preach to my younger brother James, who was in the depths of addiction. and try to tell him what to do. But his addiction defended itself. I thought he was getting angry, but it was his addiction defending itself. And he got further away from me. But it was only when he had a really challenging moment in his life, I had stopped trying to fix him. I stepped back and I sort of looked after myself and I accepted I couldn't change him. But when he had his moment, he says, wow, Brian is living a great life. It looks like he has the answers. And then he came to me, and then I could advise him to go to a treatment center. And he has a fabulous life now in recovery. He's having a baby now in a couple of months with the woman of his dreams. So it was a beautiful story, but I couldn't fix it despite my knowledge and my experience. So it's just letting go and looking after yourself. People think that's selfish or self-centered. So how would you sort of frame that?
Um, one of the analogies the metaphors analogies I really love is this idea of tug of war, and you've got two people on opposite sides of a rope, and as long as we keep pulling on our end, the people are going to be pulling on their end. But if we just let it go and walk away, there's no
Yeah.
more pulling to be done. And we see that all the time, exactly what you described with your brother. The other thing too is I think that what can be helpful in this instance is going back and looking at family of origin systems, because a lot of times the codependent enabler was identified in their family and in their childhood early on as a combination of the kid who should be helping the parents raise the other kids, and also, interestingly, the kid who's selfish for not doing more for the family. And that combination makes individuals very vulnerable to kind of this martyr like codependency, because they feel that they're fundamentally selfish people. So if they were to stop, helping this person, that would bring up old trauma of self-loathing because they feel selfish. And also then those early voices saying, you're the one that needs to help. You're the competent one. You need to get in there and help. So that kind of family structure and early self-identification as the helper, who's also the selfish one,
Yeah.
can really work in an insidious way to make it difficult for people who are in that enabling position to stop doing that behavior. One of my patients, I think for her it was complicated also by the fact that she had adopted her child, and he had had terrible trauma, and so she had such a hard time letting go because she felt like he had been traumatized. He needed this sort of all accepting, non judgmental mothering figure to make up for the mothering he hadn't had. And also, I think some self loathing, feeling that she was defective because she herself could never have her own biological children. So,
Yeah.
these sorts of my point being that we're engaging in these behaviors only in part because of the other person's needs. The larger part is really about our own psychological need to see ourselves in a certain way.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you frame that as well, to see ourselves in a certain way. And I think like there's a lovely line in addiction circles that sobriety is not the opposite of addiction, connection is. And it's a lovely soundbite, but it's certainly not the whole truth, far from it. But I often think awareness is the opposite of addiction. Like once you become aware and you see yourself, something really shifts. And there's a question I'd love to ask you. So I don't believe I'm actually in recovery. I believe I'm recovered. And I say that because I have no want, I've no need. I feel like it's sitting in a room full of heroin. And it's not that I just wouldn't use it. I don't want it. I see it as aversive because I value energy. I value health. I value learning. I value connection and relationships in my life. And that will just go against the grain of that. So I think it's a question I have as well. I think I did have a spiritual shift where something changed inside of me and I seen the world differently. I felt differently. And I changed my relationship with anxiety as a result of that. So, like, I nearly welcome anxiety into my life. It became a teacher in a way because I learned,
Mm.
right, you learn from adversity. So, if I have a stressor or anxiety in my life, I use a breathing technique or I go for a run or I connect with someone else. So, the challenge becomes the fuel to learn and grow. It helps me to grow instead of becoming the pain. So I really feel I am recovered. And obviously, I've talked to many experts on this. Some people believe you can't be recovered once in addiction, always in addiction. So, What is your experience, I suppose, because you've worked with so many people, you know the science behind it, your vast knowledge and experience, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's really important to stay open to whatever works for a given individual. And that's what we want. What works.
Yeah,
Um, and we can have the sort of these conceptualizations or these models, and we can apply them, and they can work for a lot of people, hopefully, right? And so the disease model is one conceptualization of addiction. And that disease model is akin to the 12-step model of the allergy. And and it's something that you never get rid of, so that you're always vulnerable to relapse, which is where this language of I'm in recovery, I'm never recovered comes
yeah,
from. It's really deeply rooted in the 12-step tradition. It's also consistent with the medical disease model. Um, but if that kind of language doesn't match with somebody's personal experience of their own recovery, then we shouldn't use it. Um, and especially since, again, this identity formation is important to healing. There are healthy ways to formulate our identity, and there are unhealthy ways. And if somebody like you, I'm guessing, who's gone through this huge transformation in your life, if part of what's important to your identity formation now is that you are recovered and that even the thought is aversive, like why would I argue with that? That's clearly, your experience. And more importantly, it's helpful to you.
yeah, it
So
works for me, yeah,
it works for
yeah.
you. So why would we not go with that?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I had this crazy thought one time. I was saying maybe I was never, if I feel I'm recovered, because I at the in the early days I went down the 12-step route, and I says, well, if I don't feel I'm in recovery and I'm recovered, maybe I wasn't a real addict. And I used heroin every day for 15 years. I used drugs nearly every day for 20 years. But the reality is that I've met people that fit the classical I suppose, definition of someone in addiction that they barely use drugs, but they had that thinking, sort of that stinking thinking, as we often say in addiction circles. They nearly had that more than me, but my drug use was much more. So I think it just brings it back to the complexity of addiction and the complexity of recovery. And I think what works is just a beautiful answer on that. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Again, I think we need to stay humble and stay open. The brain is still very much, a black box. We're dogs in the universe. Like we don't really know, what is going on, and so we just have to be open to what works for people, and also, respect that the language that we use or the conceptualization, you know, may not fit for somebody, and to insist on it, that may actually be harmful. I will say though that this notion that occurred to you one day, oh, well, maybe I was never even really addicted. That can be dangerous in the sense that
Yeah.
that then often leads to, well, maybe I could go back to drinking in moderation, or maybe
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
could use heroin now and then, and my life's so much better now, and in this context, it probably wouldn't be a big deal. So, and to tell you the truth, in rare instances, I've seen people do that and
Yeah.
be
I so.
okay, but most of the time not. Most of
Mm.
the time, either instantly or gradually, they slip back into those addictive behaviors. So, there's a lot at risk there.
Yeah. It's nearly why do you want to be using the drug? I think that's where I always come back to what sort of the motivation behind that. And I think that's where that values driven stuff I think is really important for myself to know what's important to me and then to be taking actions that align with that really is what's important.
Yeah, I mean, a values-driven life is definitely a powerful framework, but I guess I would push back a little bit on the idea that as long as you're using for the right reasons, you're gonna be okay, because we can talk ourselves into just about anything, and I think what's more important is what happens when you do use. So independent of your rationale, what are the facts of what happens when you use? And let's just go with the facts. And if the facts are that you either instantly or pretty quickly can't control your use, have consequences related to your use, are constantly thinking about using or whatever it is, then that, even if your intentions were good, you're probably not that person who
Yeah,
can
yeah.
use in that way.
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, and it's like, why would you? That would really be the thing for myself. There's something I'd love to ask, and I really touched on this idea of the sense of self and identity and stuff like that, and why people don't like getting out of their comfort zones as well. But it's more less to do with addiction and sort of more to do with general change, I suppose. Again, back to the podcast as change as possible. But why do you believe that so many people struggle with change? And there's probably not science to back that up, but I suppose in your experience, like, why is change so hard for people even when they genuinely want it?
Um, because we are really wired to decrease uncertainty as we explore and navigate the world. And anything that we can do to decrease uncertainty is going to be instinctively our go-to. And some people discover, you know, at some point in their lives, and I would say increasingly we have ways to do this, is that drugs and addictive behaviors are a way to predict and organize our lives and decrease uncertainty. So we create a kind of alternative reality where we are the master of the universe. And even if we're miserable, at least we're in control.
Yeah,
And I think that is a major driver, which means that for us to be healthier, we really need to be able to tolerate the uncertainty that is inherent in being alive.
yeah. Yeah, I love that, and it's nearly that uncertainty. It's nearly triggering at that visceral level because from an evolutionary perspective, uncertainty was a scary thing. It could mean death. It could mean you're unsafe. The tribe is in danger. So it really comes back to those evolutionary core things. What's next for you, Anna? Have any plans? Any big plans in
Oh gosh,
the
I'm
diary?
I I've been very fortunate with Dopamine Nation, still getting lots
Yes.
of
And
speaking requests.
incredible book. Anyone that's interested, and I'll just say this, anyone interested in addiction, but phone addiction, modern addiction, like Dopamine Nation. I remember you said it to me, Anna, because the book is called Dopamine Nation. But we were having a conversation. You said it's a dopamine nation. Like never in the world has dopamine been flooding the whole world on a general level more than it has been. So what a book. What a book.
Thank you. Yeah. And now it's been translated into something like 38 languages. So I have lots of opportunities to travel. We're going to Korea in September. I'm really excited about that. We'll
Amazing.
be in Taiwan in the spring. We've been to Brazil and to Poland, lots of other places. So that's been just really gratifying. There are a lot of people in the world who don't have access to some of this basic knowledge about the brain and about addiction. So super gratifying. And then I just continue to do my clinical practice here at Stanford to teach. We've got lots of wonderful young people coming through who want to learn about addiction, which is so great because 20 years ago, medical students, residents weren't interested in learning about addiction. So this is a really great sea change in the
Yeah.
field. Yeah, and just trying to stay sane, Brian. I don't know about you, but I'm just trying to not go too crazy.
Oh, Anna, this
Challenge
is my, yeah,
challenge for me
this is
personally.
my team. My team for the year was my team for 2024 was pulling back. Then I had the opportunity to do the TV documentary and I was already needed to clone myself. So it was a crazy year. So 2025 was pulling back no matter what. And I'm actually taking a 4 week break next week, really pulling back just to not be crazy. That's the mantra for the year. But it's something else, Anna. I'd love before I let you go, I'd love to ask you because I'm doing a lot of work with I'm starting to do a lot of work with young kids with mental health challenges, and obviously phones are a massive part of that, and dopamine plays a massive role in that. What advice would you have, generally speaking, for the younger generation in terms of phones, in terms of pornography, in terms of Instagram, social media feeds, like the challenges in terms of dopamine and addiction for the young generation? Because it's a scary place.
Yeah, so hard. So I guess, as a starting place, I would recommend that no child under the age of 13 has their own device with access to the internet. And if parents are concerned about safety and wanted to reach their children, I recommend a dumb phone that has text and other simple applications. But the internet is a scary place, and children do not have the capacity, given the stage of development of their brains, to be able to navigate the internet. I think adults barely have that capacity.
Yeah.
So I recommend that young kids do not have uh, unfettered access to the internet, either on a mobile device or really any device. And then I recommend that with teens, there just be a lot of open discussion about how fraught the internet, social media, online pornography, online gaming, online gambling, online shopping, all of it, right? And really highlight that yes, this is a remarkable tool, and it's also inevitable. It's integrated into every aspect of our lives, but there are real serious downsides and dark sides, and we need to both individually and collectively figure out how we're going to have a healthier relationship with the technology. I've done a lot of advocacy around schools and advising schools to either limit smartphones during school hours, bell to bell, so not just during classes and not leaving it up to the teacher, but making it a top-down school-wide policy. I'm excited about some technology that's being developed now that would allow a kind of airplane Wi-Fi mode. So instead of physically removing the phones, which is hard to do and complicated and cumbersome, you would
Mm,
have folks download an app and sort of opt into this, airplane Wi-Fi mode, so that they couldn't access the internet during school hours, except through specific school-based sanctioned platforms. I think that's the direction in general that we need to
yeah.
go. And then I also do think we need to hold the companies that make and profit from these devices,
To
accountable for the
account, yeah.
harm to kids, especially, the harm to kids. So, we really need to have age verification. And this is already happening in 2 states here in the United States with respect to Pornhub and other pornography sites. And of course, it is in direct conflict to some privacy rights people feel, because it requires registering with a third party in order to access a pornography site, which of course no adult wants to do. But I
Yeah.
think there are ways to protect adult privacy and also protect kids, because we just have to recognize the vulnerability of kids' brains and protect them for as long as possible. We have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And I had a conversation today, and it only just came back to mind with a workshop I was doing, and a woman on the workshop, her son was down. It's called the Gaeltacht in Ireland. It's basically where kids go to the west of Ireland to speak Irish only. They're not allowed to speak any other language, and for a couple of weeks, but they're not allowed to have their phones for only a half an hour each week. They're allowed to have their phones, and they make a call back to the family. And the woman was telling me, she says, my son, he was 17 years of age. He called me, and I says, we're having a conversation, and says, I thought you'd be more upbeat. Are you okay? Is everything okay? And he says, yeah, everything's grand, man, but we all got our phones back, and everyone's getting bad news, and things are going on, and nobody really wanted their phones, and it's really had to putting a downer on everything. So kids don't want their phones. It was when we done the doc, there was a kid says, I wish TikTok was never invented. They don't want these things. They just don't want to be left out. And we have a responsibility to do something about it. We really do.
Yep, I
So
agree.
lovely.
Yep, absolutely. It's not just the individual harms, it's the diffuse collective harms and the
Yeah.
FOMO and all of that. And as you say, the kids will tell you themselves, I wish it wasn't invented, you know.
Yeah. It's crazy. Anna, thank you again so much for your time. It's always an absolute pleasure having a conversation with yourself. I will get over to California at some stage. Hold you to that hike. We'll go on
Wow.
the hike at some stage. But the weather sounds fab over there. So I definitely I'm hoping to get over stateside at some stage in 2025 for a podcast. So hopefully we get to chat in person very, very soon.
Yeah, that'd be super.
But it's been an absolute pleasure, Anna. Thanks again for coming on, and I'll chat to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you enjoyed this content, I've created a range of online courses around mindset, mastering your self-talk, unlocking the secrets of addiction recovery and morning routines, and many, many more. If you're interested, simply click on the link in the show notes and use the word resilience to get free access to all of that content.